So if you know a little bit about track, you'll know that the runner who is on the inside of this track actually has a shorter distance to run than the person who is on the outside, so the person in yellow. So it may look fair to start them all on the same line, but they'll actually have an uneven race in terms of what they have to cover. Where in the bottom picture for equity, they're all spread out just a little bit differently. So it might look a little bit unfair just at the look of it, but when you look at what they actually have to run, it's actually more fair and more proportional for us to spread them out this way. So if we're talking about school funding, for example, advocating for equality would be ensuring that our schools are all getting the same amount of resources per student. Where if we're advocating for equity, that would mean recognizing some of our schools, like those that are serving under-resourced communities, are actually going to need more resources to make a dent in some of this educational disparities that they're facing. So they might need more funding, more relevant curriculum, or more experienced teachers. So here at Reading Partners, we're committed to educational equity and to closing the opportunity gap for our students. And this is really the heart of everything we're doing here. And again, we're doing this by partnering with our schools and the communities there and providing this instruction and meeting our students where they're at through this one-on-one individualized instruction. And through that, we're also offering diverse texts and social emotional learning. We're also pouring into our AmeriCorps service members and our workforce by providing some development there as well. Next, before we talk about our students, we just want to cover some myths that tend to come up in the process of learning to read or as people are teaching students how to read. And we just really want to root us in the reality of what it is that some of them are facing. So one of the big common myths is that reading is a natural process. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. We're wired to speak and to listen, but reading itself is actually a cultural invention. So it's something that we have to be taught and systematically work at to get better, because it is a skill we have to acquire. Another myth is that reading well is a marker of intelligence. And the reality here is there really is no reading gene. Reading is a learned skill, again. So some people have different strengths and different things that they are challenged by. And just because one thing is challenging for one person and it's not for another doesn't really have anything to do with intelligence necessarily. So we just want to keep that reality in mind and even just keep a growth mindset as we're working with our student. Another popular myth is that students who are struggling to read are not trying hard enough or have a learning disability. And this can just be a problematic way of thinking, especially as it can have a negative impact on our students and the way they feel about themselves or the way that they feel about reading and then therefore perform in reading. So this is just one of those problematic ways of thinking that can impact our sessions with a student. So we really just want to focus again on the realities here, and the reality is that it takes time, reading takes time and practice to master. And some people are just going to need more practice than others. So again, just keep that growth mindset as you're working with your student. Lastly, a common myth is that gender and or socioeconomic status play a role in a student's reading ability. And this is another problematic way of thinking where we just don't want to be stereotyping our students, especially as it comes to race, class, or gender. So the process of learning to read really doesn't discriminate, but it can have an impact on our students' performance and how they feel about reading. So again, we just want to root ourselves in the reality here and know that sometimes, it's just going to be different for each student. So next we're going to be talking about our students. So the students that we're working with this year is a little different than who we served in our previous years here at Reading Partners. We typically worked with kindergarten to third grade students, but this year we're just going to be focusing on first through fourth grade students since we're in this distance tutoring mode. So all of our students are going to be somewhere between first and fourth grade. They're reading somewhere between 6 months to 2.5 years behind in reading level. And we're still working primarily from Title I schools. And all of the students that we serve have conversational English skills, and they're also just coming from diverse backgrounds and experiences just like us. So next I want to lead us through a little exercise, and so I really just want us here to be thinking about and trying to envision the student that we might be working with this year. So we can think about how old they are, what race they are, what gender they are, and we can even think about some challenges they might face as a reader. and we can even think about what their family life is like. So to be envisioning our student and form this idea, we have to use some assumptions to imagine our student. And so maybe we did make some assumptions about their family or home life, or even, their gender or race. So these little decisions and assumptions we made are actually called implicit biases. And these are just unconscious attitudes or actions or stereotypes that we have that might affect our understanding, actions, or decisions towards another person. So we all have them. It doesn't mean that we're bad people, but especially as we're working with our students, we just want to be conscious of these assumptions and be checking to make sure that they're actually accurate. And if they're not, we need to be working to disrupt them and change and be thinking about what we can do to change them. So implicit biases can still show up in our sessions as assumptions, comments, or even behaviors towards our students, their families, or even the communities that we're serving. To combat this and to gain more awareness, it is going to take some work outside of reading partners. So we've just listed some things here that we can be doing on our own to be working through this and confronting these implicit biases that we may have. So a few things you could do is just take an implicit association test, which just would give you a snapshot of how some of this would show up in your everyday life so that we can be more aware of it and then be disrupting them that way. Also, there's just a lot of literature out there that we have access to that we could be informing ourselves with through independent reading, and just gaining knowledge there and more awareness will also help us to combat this. What we can do in our sessions especially is just pause and reflect in the moment, question these assumptions that might be coming up. For example, in some of our schools, if a student came in without a jacket, and we might have thought there might be a neglect situation there, where the reality is they might have just forgotten their jacket in their classroom or in the hallway or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their family doesn't care or there's neglect happening at their homes. So just keep those kind of things in mind as you're working with your students. So just be questioning even those kinds of assumptions as you're working with them. And if anything does come up that you're concerned about or unsure of how to process that, just feel free to connect with a Reading Partners member. We're not experts, but we definitely want to be holding each other accountable and supporting each other in this area of working through implicit biases. On the next slide, you'll be prompted to reflect on these implicit biases and how we can be working to disrupt them throughout the year.